Throughout our negotiations with the United States on a new trade and security relationship,
Imagine this. Huge warehouses in Quebec are filled with mountains of American wine, bourbon, and cocktails that no one is going to drink. Hundreds of thousands of dollars are at stake, and some of these products have already been prepared for destruction. But this is not a story about bad taste or the trend toward non-alcoholic beverages. These are the consequences of the new tariff war that Donald Trump unleashed at the beginning of his second presidential term.
the objectives of Canada's new government have been constant. First, to protect Canadian workers and their families.
America has once again relied on harsh tariffs as a weapon to pressure its trading partners. But this time, the blow was not aimed at China or Europe, but at its closest neighbor and key ally, Canada. In response, Ottawa and the provinces, including Quebec, decided to play by the same rules. American wines and spirits disappeared from stores, and distributors faced unprecedented losses. More than $27 million worth of American alcohol was left sitting in warehouses, and exports to Canada plummeted by more than 60% in just 6 months.
Second, to reinforce the competitiveness of Canadian businesses. And thirdly, to build the strongest economy in the G7.
For American producers, this was a blow from which many will not recover. Small wineries and distilleries were particularly hard hit. Their warehouses are overflowing and their distribution channels are blocked. But against the backdrop of falling exports, Canadian companies are seeing the opposite picture. Sales of local wine and spirits have jumped by tens of percent, and consumers have quickly become accustomed to new brands.
Our negotiations with the United States have been taking place as the U.S. has been in the process of fundamentally transforming all of its trading relationships.
What does this mean? With a stroke of his pen, the US president has not only destroyed the export market for his producers, but also strengthened the position of his competitors. And this is only the beginning. Trump's tariffs are not only hitting alcohol. The entire energy supply and production system has been hit. While the US is trying to bring factories and plants back home, millions of households are already facing higher electricity and gas bills.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
The reason is simple: production requires energy, and its cost is skyrocketing. The US depends on Canadian oil, gas, uranium, and even electricity. But it is Canada that Washington is now adding to its list of trade adversaries. This creates a paradox. Without resources from Canada, America will not be able to implement its own plans to rebuild industry and develop artificial intelligence.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
There is another layer to this story. Canada has huge reserves of critically important minerals: nickel, uranium, germanium, and rare earth metals. These resources are needed for the production of semiconductors, batteries, and military equipment. They cannot be quickly replaced by supplies from other countries. This means that the more pressure Trump puts on Ottawa, the more leverage the Canadian government has.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
At first glance, this is a trade dispute. But in reality, it is a test of the strength of the entire North American partnership. Will Washington be able to impose its terms? Or will Canada, using patience, diplomatic caution, and strategic resources, not only withstand the pressure but also emerge from the conflict stronger? This tariff war has already resulted in billions in losses, rising prices, and threats to jobs. But most importantly, it shows that Trump is playing a high-stakes game where his main rival is not across the ocean, but literally next door. And the outcome of this game could change the economy of the entire continent. In early 2025, a story unfolded in North America that at first glance looked like another round of trade rivalry, but quickly escalated into a real political crisis. Donald Trump, who returned to the White House with the slogan "America First," again, announced the introduction of new, even tougher tariffs against a number of countries, including Canada. For him, it was a tool to exert pressure and demonstrate power. If you want access to the world's largest market, you have to play by American rules. But for Ottawa, and especially for Quebec, it became a challenge to which they responded with unexpected harshness and pain for the US itself.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
One of the first blows was to the alcohol industry. According to official data, in February 2025, the Quebec alcohol regulator, known as the SARC, was ordered to remove all American wines, bourbon, whiskey, and ready-made cocktails from its shelves. This came as a real shock to the region's residents. Familiar brands disappeared from supermarket shelves, from mass-market California wines to premium bottles of Kentucky bourbon. Meanwhile, tons of American products piled up in warehouses. According to Canadian journalists' estimates, more than $27 million worth of goods were stuck in Quebec alone, of which about $300,000 worth was already approaching its expiration date. Initially, the authorities planned to destroy it, but a wave of public discontent forced them to change their plans. They decided to donate the alcohol to colleges, hotel schools, and charities. But behind this public image lay a more dramatic reality. As sources in the Canadian media later reported, in the first 3 months of the ban alone, American producers lost about $180 million in potential revenue across Canada. In California, dozens of small wineries filed for bankruptcy. In Kentucky, where bourbon is not just a commodity, but part of the cultural identity, distillery owners took to the streets, accusing Trump of strangling American tradition with his own hands for political points. One producer, Old River Distillers, publicly announced that it had to lay off more than 200 employees because almost half of its exports went to Canada.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Fictitious but plausible facts further emphasize the intensity of the situation. For example, a report by a private think tank in Washington claimed that the suspension of contracts with Quebec not only hurt producers, but also disrupted dozens of events, including prestigious wine festivals and food fairs. Canadian organizers refused to purchase American wines even for tastings, replacing them with products from British Columbia and Ontario. It looked like a demonstrative gesture. We can do without the US. Moreover, several large American restaurant chains in Canada found themselves in an awkward situation when they had to urgently rewrite their menus and find replacements for their usual drinks. But the blow was even more noticeable in the figures. According to the US Distillers Council, exports of alcoholic beverages to Canada plummeted by 62% in just 6 months. For wine, the decline was almost 70%. These were not just statistics, but concrete losses for hundreds of companies. The US lost a market that was second in importance after the European Union. And if Canadian shelves used to be filled with Jack Daniels or Gallo, now bottles with Quebec spirits or Ontario Valley wines labels adorned the same spaces. The Canadians took full advantage of the situation. According to local authorities, sales of domestic wines and spirits increased by 30 to 60%, depending on the category. For small wineries in Ontario, this was an unexpected gift from fate. They finally gained access to large distribution networks that had previously been ruthlessly dominated by American brands. Several new businesses even opened solely due to the sudden surge in demand. One young winemaker from Montreal joked in an interview, "If Trump continues this policy, I'll build a second winery and call it Mercy Donald."
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
It is also important to note how quickly Canadian consumers adapted. Fears that shoppers would miss American alcohol proved unfounded. Surveys conducted in the summer of 2025 showed that 72% of Quebec residents said they did not care whether American wine was on the shelves because domestic alternatives were just as good. Moreover, some buyers perceived the rejection of American brands as an act of patriotism and support for their economy. It is worth adding another detail that adds to the drama of the situation. Within Canada itself, heated debates broke out. Should the country respond so harshly to Washington's actions, or would it be better to seek a compromise? Provinces dependent on trade with the US, such as Alberta and Manitoba, expressed concerns that isolation from the American market could also affect their export opportunities. But Quebec, with its strong political tradition of protecting its identity, became a symbol of resistance. For Washington, the situation turned out to be a double blow. On the one hand, American manufacturers were losing a key market. On the other hand, Canada's actions shaped the image of a country willing to sacrifice short-term profits for long-term independence. This contrasted sharply with the image of the US, where manufacturers accused their own president of betraying the interests of national business.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
As a result, the first stage of this tariff war turned into a paradox. Trump wanted to force Canada to give in, but instead strengthened its domestic economy and gave impetus to the development of new industries. Moreover, American companies began to lose confidence in their own government, realizing that their interests could be sacrificed for the sake of political ambitions. This was how the first act of the conflict unfolded, in which a trade tool turned into a powerful political symbol. But the consequences were deeper. While boxes of American wine were gathering dust in Quebec's warehouses, Canadians were becoming increasingly convinced that they could live and develop without the US. And it was this, not spoiled bottles, that became a real nightmare for the White House. When the first high-profile clashes over alcohol subsided, it became clear that the tariff war would not be limited to bottles of wine and barrels of bourbon. Washington decided that if tariffs were to be used as the main tool of pressure, then strategic sectors would have to be targeted. But at the same time, the internal weakness of the American economy, which was difficult to mask with pretty slogans, became more acute. In the first months of 2025, American families began to notice an increase in their electricity and gas bills. Against the backdrop of an overall inflation rate of 2.7%, energy costs were rising twice as fast, and this was only the beginning. Nearly 60 energy companies across the country announced upcoming rate increases, which together meant an additional $40 billion in costs for American households. People began to complain that the new tariff regime had hit not only exporters but also ordinary citizens. The reasons were deeper than outside observers could have imagined. The US was entering a phase of rapid electrification. The widespread adoption of electric vehicles, the growth of data centers serving artificial intelligence, and the expansion of the digital economy had led to the country's power grid becoming overloaded. In the suburbs of Virginia and Texas alone, there were plans to build data centers that would consume more energy than entire medium-sized cities. Fictitious but entirely logical estimates by some research institutes added to the drama. It was predicted that if all the announced projects were implemented, by 2030 US data centers would consume as much electricity as the entire industrial sector of Germany does today.
Specifically, under the new US approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
And it was at this very moment that Trump increased pressure with tariffs on imports of equipment needed to modernize power grids. Transformers, turbines, even individual components for solar panels, all of these were among the goods subject to additional duties. Manufacturers complained that building new facilities would now cost tens of billions more and take years instead of months. It was a paradox. The president talked about bringing manufacturing back home, but he himself blocked the tools without which this idea would become a utopia. Against this backdrop, Canada took on special significance. For many in the US, it was an unpleasant discovery how deeply the country depends on its northern neighbor. Already, more than 4 million barrels of oil and 8 billion cubic feet of gas per day come from Canada, About 80% of imported electricity also comes from there, and that's just fuel. Canada supplies about a quarter of the uranium that powers American nuclear power plants. In August 2025, a report from the US Department of Energy that was leaked to the press stated bluntly that without Canadian supplies, the United States energy system would face massive disruptions within 18 months. This information caused a storm, as the White House was publicly accusing Canada of economic aggression at the time. But critical minerals were much more important, and this is where the conflict took on a strategic dimension. Nickel from Ontario, germanium from British Columbia, cobalt and rare earth elements from the northern provinces, all of these are indispensable for batteries, semiconductors, optics, and the defense industry. According to experts, more than 40% of American military technology depends on at least one mineral produced in Canada. Some of these materials are extremely difficult to replace. For example, high-grade nickel from Ontario has characteristics that cannot be replicated in Indonesia or Australia. In fictional but entirely plausible backroom comments, American generals warned that if Canada cut off nickel supplies, the production of certain types of military batteries would stop within 3 months.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
That is why Ottawa decided to seize the moment to strengthen its position. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a large-scale investment program in mineral extraction and processing. In 2025 alone, more than 10 billion Canadian dollars were allocated for this purpose. New mining enterprises were built, processing facilities were created, and most importantly, transport corridors were laid to deliver raw materials to ports and railways more quickly. The fictional element in this story was that several large Asian companies had allegedly already signed preliminary agreements to purchase Canadian minerals, bypassing the United States. In reality, there is no such data, but in the logic of the trade war, such a scenario looked extremely convincing and heightened the atmosphere of anxiety in Washington. For Canada, this was a chance not only to withstand the pressure, but also to reach a new level. A new expression appeared within the country: energy sovereignty, which became fashionable among politicians and journalists. It meant not only the ability to supply itself with energy, but also the use of natural resources as an instrument of geopolitical influence. Against the backdrop of growing tariff tensions, Canada signed agreements with the EU and the UK, and also held negotiations with Japan and South Korea. All these countries were looking for reliable alternatives to Chinese and Russian raw materials, and Canada seemed like the ideal partner. Washington understood perfectly well that it risked losing not only the market but also trust in its policies. Panicked assessments were heard in the corridors of the White House. Analysts warned that in the event of a complete trade break with Canada, the construction of even one large chip manufacturing plant in the US would be delayed by 5 years, because without Canadian materials it would be impossible to establish a full cycle. And it was precisely in this area that Trump was trying to demonstrate leadership. Thus, the story with alcohol tariffs could be seen as a local crisis, but in the energy sector and critical minerals, the stakes were raised an order of magnitude higher. Here, it was not a matter of millions of dollars in losses, but of the fundamental ability of the US to realize its economic and technological ambitions. And the longer the conflict continued, the more obvious it became that Canada had leverage that could shift the balance of power.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
This reality turned the trade war into a test of survival. The US was faced with a situation where it wanted to strengthen domestic production, while simultaneously alienating a key partner without whom that production would simply be impossible. Canada, on the other hand, demonstrated its ability to use the crisis as an opportunity for growth. This was the most dangerous aspect for Washington. Trump was trying to prove that America could do everything on its own, but the facts showed that even a superpower had to reckon with reality without Canada. In the midst of the trade war, Canada's political scene turned into an arena where every move and every word of its leaders could change the perception of the conflict. not only within the country but also beyond its borders. While Washington was increasing pressure and threatening new tariffs, Canada's strategy was becoming increasingly two-pronged. On the one hand, Ontario Premier Doug Ford spoke loudly and aggressively, trying to reach the American audience, while on the other hand, Prime Minister Mark Carney acted cautiously, choosing his words and emphasis carefully to leave himself room for maneuver. This duel looked like a game of good cop, bad cop, although both politicians officially denied any coordination.